I never told my wife that I secretly owned nearly half of her father's company, a position worth more than $15 billion. For 23 years, she knew me only as a low-profile consultant with an aging car and a small apartment. Then, one Tuesday, she invited me to dinner with her parents. I agreed, curious to see how they would treat a man they believed had no real standing. Their smiles were measured, their questions carefully pointed, and halfway through the meal, her father slid a leather envelope across the table. In that instant, I understood the evening had never been about family at all. Before I explain what happened next, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'm genuinely curious how far this story reaches. The text message had arrived earlier that same Tuesday morning, and I knew immediately what it meant. I was 53 years old, married to Evelyn for over 2 decades, and during that time I'd learned to recognize the weight of her silence. This silence, the kind where she stared at her phone while her coffee cooled untouched, meant her parents were plotting something. "Let me guess," I said from across our kitchen table in Cambridge. "Your mother." Evelyn looked up, and her expression confirmed it. She slid her phone toward me across the scratched wooden table we'd bought at a yard sale 19 years earlier. The message was short, formal, and unsettling in its precision. "Dinner. Friday. 7 p.m. Important family matter. Mother." "When my parents get this formal," Evelyn said softly, "someone usually gets hurt." She was right. Helen Whitman never did casual. Every interaction was calculated, every word deliberate. A dinner invitation sent by text instead of a call wasn't a gathering, it was a negotiation. "We're going," I said. "Daniel, I want to see what they're planning." What Evelyn didn't know, what she couldn't know, because I'd spent 18 months making sure she didn't, was that I'd been waiting for this moment. I'd watched it forming in the sideways remarks at Thanksgiving, in the way Charles Whitman looked at me as if I were a loose end that needed cutting, and in how their daughter Lydia had begun treating me like an inconvenience instead of a brother-in-law. They believed they held all the leverage. They believed I was exactly what I appeared to be, a 53-year-old logistics consultant driving a 7-year-old Honda and living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood landscapers ignored. What they didn't know was the truth. 27 years earlier, I'd inherited $500,000 from my grandfather. While most people would have upgraded their lifestyle, I invested it in a struggling shipping company run by Charles Whitman, who was buried under debt after the Asian shipping crisis and unable to secure financing from anyone who'd examined his books. I studied that company for months before buying in. The fundamentals were sound, the roots profitable, he just needed capital. I accumulated shares quietly through layered entities and offshore trusts that led nowhere near my name. Within 3 years, I owned 15%. By the time I met Evelyn at a charity auction, I controlled 31%. By the time we married, 42%. Today, I held 47% of Whitman Maritime and Logistics Corporation. At current valuations, my stake was worth roughly $15 billion. Charles Whitman worked for me. He just didn't know it. "Daniel." Evelyn's voice brought me back. She was watching me with the same eyes that had seen me through graduate school, career shifts, and her parents' relentless disapproval. "Promise me you won't let them push you around." I reached across the table and took her hand. "I promise they'll finally see who I am." She squeezed my fingers, trusting me the way she always had, trusting me when I'd asked her to live simply so we could build a life on substance instead of appearances. She had never questioned it, never asked for explanations. Friday would bring the confrontation I'd been quietly preparing for, and this time I wasn't going to stay silent. Friday arrived wrapped in the kind of cold November evening that makes Boston feel especially unforgiving. I drove our Honda through Cambridge as twilight settled over the streets, Evelyn sitting beside me in silence, her hand resting on the center console where I could reach it. We'd made this drive dozens of times over the past 23 years, but tonight felt different, like we were crossing an invisible border into hostile territory. Cambridge slipped by outside the windows, brick buildings, graduate students hurrying against the cold, the familiar calm of our neighborhood where professors, artists, and working families lived side by side. Then we crossed into Wellesley, and everything shifted. The roads widened, the houses grew larger, set far back behind stone walls and perfectly kept lawns. Even winter couldn't dull the impression. This was old money, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew it existed. the kind that looked at my 7-year-old Honda and saw failure instead of choice. Evelyn's hand tightened around mine as I turned onto her parents' street. The stone estate sat on 3 acres that likely cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Even in the fading light, it felt less like a home and more like a museum, all columns and symmetry, silently declaring its importance to anyone who passed by. I pulled into the circular driveway, and before I could even shut off the engine, the front door opened. It wasn't her mother standing there. It was the housekeeper Susan waiting in the doorway. That told me everything. This wasn't a family dinner. It was a transaction. "They're really doing this," Evelyn whispered. "Let them," I said. Susan greeted us with polished professionalism, taking our coats without quite meeting my eyes. Then Charles Whitman appeared in the foyer, 72 years old and still carrying himself like a man who believed he'd built an empire. Daniel. His handshake was meant to assert dominance. Too firm. Held a beat too long. "Evelyn, sweetheart." Helen Whitman emerged from the living room moments later. 69 and impeccably elegant in the way that required constant effort. She embraced Evelyn warmly. Hen turned to me and delivered an air kiss that hovered near my cheek without ever making contact. "So good of you to come," she said, her tone suggesting the opposite. "Mom, Dad, they're here," came Lydia's voice from deeper inside the house, casual and uninterested. I spotted her in the living room, 20 years old, scrolling through her phone as if our arrival barely registered. "Hi, honey," Evelyn said gently. "Oh," Lydia replied, glancing up for barely a second before her attention drifted back to the screen. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad." Lydia said, "Dad," the way someone acknowledges a stranger. I remembered her at 7 years old asking why we didn't live in a big house like Grandma and Grandpa. I'd tried to explain values back then, about building something real instead of something merely impressive. She'd nodded, but even then I could tell she didn't really understand, or maybe didn't want to. "Shall we?" Charles gestured toward the dining room. The table was set for 5. Crystal glasses reflected the chandelier's light. China plates that probably cost more than our monthly rent waited at each place, and the seating arrangement told me exactly how this night was meant to unfold. Charles at the head, Helen to his right, Lydia seated beside her grandmother, already aligned. Evelyn and I were placed across from them, physically separated, outnumbered, isolated. We took our seats. Moments later, Susan appeared with the first course. As she placed the plates down, I could feel the trap tightening. They'd spent days preparing this, but they had no idea who they were trying to corner. Charles lifted his wine glass, the crystal flashing as he smiled. "To family," he said. The word felt less like a toast and more like a warning. The first course passed with stiff pleasantries, the kind that always come before something unpleasant. Charles asked about my work with the careful condescension of a man questioning a child about finger painting. Helen commented on the weather. Lydia scrolled through her phone between bites, offering nothing until her grandmother shot her a look that suggested even contempt had to be timed properly. The main course arrived, an expensive-looking fish that probably cost more per ounce than I spent on groceries in a week. That was when Charles truly began. "We just finalized the New Atlantic shipping route expansion," he said, cutting his fish with precise, deliberate movements. 10-year project. $2 billion in investment. Takes real vision to spot opportunities like that. He spoke as if he were explaining advanced physics to someone who'd barely passed basic math. I'd approved that funding, I thought. Every dollar had come from my holdings. "You're lecturing me about a project I greenlit 18 months ago." Out loud, I simply nodded. "Sounds ambitious." The response seemed to disappoint him. He'd wanted engagement, maybe resistance. Instead, I gave him nothing. Helen smoothly picked up the thread. "Evelyn, did I mention I ran into Marcus Halden last week?" Her tone was light, casual, the way people sound just before they strike. "He's doing remarkably well. Just bought a place in Beacon Hill. Absolutely stunning." Evelyn's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "I'm happy with my life, Mother." "Of course you are, sweetheart." Helen's smile could have cut glass. "I just find it interesting how life turns out, don't you? The choices we make." Across the table, Lydia finally looked up from her phone. "Grandfather's given me real responsibilities now," she said, and I couldn't tell whether she was speaking to me or past me. I'm coordinating with the logistics team on the new terminal integration. Real work. Strategic work. That's wonderful, honey, Evelyn said, trying to meet her eyes. But Lydia was looking at me now, really looking at me for the first time all evening. Some of us are actually building careers, she said, not just consulting. She said the word like it was something unpleasant she'd stepped on. Evelyn's voice sharpened, the edge I'd heard countless times over 23 years when she defended me to her family. Lydia. What? Lydia said. I'm just being honest. She turned to her mother. Don't you ever wish you'd made different choices? Don't you ever wonder what life would be like if you'd married someone with real ambition? The silence that followed was absolute. Evelyn's face drained of color. That's your father you're talking about, she said. Lydia shrugged, as if she'd commented on the weather instead of questioning her mother's entire marriage. I remained perfectly still. I could tell it irritated them more than any protest would have. They wanted me to react, to defend myself, to prove I cared about their opinion. But after 23 years, I understood this family. Tonight wasn't about conversation. It was about positioning. They were circling, testing, setting the stage. Dessert came and went. Susan cleared the plates with practiced efficiency. For a brief moment, the silence felt like a held breath. Then Charles cleared his throat and reached beneath his chair. When his hand came back up, it held a leather folder. The soft thud, as it landed on the table between crystal glasses, silenced the room. Charles slid it toward me with the confidence of a man who believed he was closing yet another deal. Inside, neatly stapled with meticulous care, was an annulment agreement. Clipped to the front was a check for $350,000. Daniel Whitman said, leaning back like a judge about to deliver a verdict, I'll be direct. You married above your station. That's not an insult. It's a fact. Evelyn could have had anyone. She could have had Marcus. We tried to accept this marriage. Evelyn stiffened beside me. Helen leaned forward. We can't stand by and watch our daughter struggle financially out of pride. This resolves everything, Daniel continued, tapping the check. That amount is more than you'd earn in 10 years as a consultant. Sign the annulment, take the money, and move on. You'll be better off. And Evelyn can return to a life appropriate to her background. The silence pressed in on all sides. Evelyn stood so abruptly her chair scraped the floor. This is insane. You can't do this to people. Evelyn, sit down, Daniel said, his voice weighted with decades of authority. The adults are talking. I'm 48 years old, Dad, she shot back, her voice cracking. My husband is sitting right here while you're trying to erase him. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at me, certain the outcome was already decided. Then Lydia spoke. Mom, her voice was calm. Grandmother's right. You deserve better. Evelyn turned toward our daughter, disbelief wrestling with hope. Lydia. Dad, be honest. Lydia met my eyes, 20 years old and absolutely sure of herself. You're holding Mom back. You live in a tiny apartment. You drive that embarrassing car. Everyone knows you're not good enough for her. She said it like a simple, obvious truth. Take the money and go. You'd be doing everyone a favor. That's your father, Evelyn cried. Lydia turned to her mother, almost gently. Mom, you could be with someone like Marcus. Someone with a real future. Someone who wouldn't make you choose between family and marriage. Someone who wouldn't embarrass you. Evelyn broke then, the way people do when something inside finally shatters. I stayed still. I'd known this moment was coming for 18 months, but knowing isn't the same as living it. Watching my daughter weigh my worth and discard me hurt more than anything her parents had said. I had loved Evelyn without conditions through lean years and quiet victories, believing respect grew from patience. I'd swallowed every slight from her parents, every smile that measured my income before my character. I thought time would soften them. I thought my daughter saw more. In that moment, I understood how neatly money edits a story, how easily comfort masquerades as wisdom. They weren't offering a choice, they were erasing me. The cruelest part wasn't the check, it was realizing that love measured in numbers had already been declared insufficient. It felt final, like a verdict reached long before I entered the room. I picked up the check and studied it, letting them believe I was tempted. That's generous, I said quietly. Daniel smiled. I set the check down and took out my phone. Before I respond, I need to make a quick call. Daniel frowned. What does your attorney have to do with this? I looked at him steadily. Everything. I dialed Desmond Garrett, the attorney who'd managed my interests for 27 years, put the phone on speaker, and placed it in the center of the table beside the torn check. Daniel, Desmond said calmly, I've been expecting your call. Desmond, I'm having dinner with the Whitman family. Please explain the current ownership structure of Whitman Maritime and Logistics. Of course, he replied without hesitation. Whitman Maritime and Logistics Corporation has 100 million shares outstanding. The largest shareholder is Brennan Holdings LLC, which owns 47 million shares, or 47% of the company. Daniel frowned. What is this supposed to? Desmond continued, unfazed. The second largest shareholder is Daniel Whitman, personally, holding 18 million shares, or 18%. The remaining 35% is divided among institutional and private investors. The silence was absolute. Desmond, I said, who owns Brennan Holdings? Brennan Holdings is wholly owned by you, Daniel Brennan, he answered. It was established 27 years ago using an inheritance. At today's closing price, the Whitman Maritime position is valued at approximately $15 billion. Helen's wine glass slipped from her hand and rolled across the table. Lydia's phone hit the floor. Daniel stared at the speaker as if reality itself had shifted. This is impossible, he whispered. I thought Brennan Holdings was an institutional investor. You never asked, I said. The money always arrived when you needed it. I stood and walked around the table until I faced him. 27 years ago, your company was collapsing. The Asian shipping crisis nearly destroyed you. No bank would touch you. He tried to speak and couldn't. I was 26. I'd inherited $500,000 from my grandfather. I studied your business for months. Your fundamentals were strong. You just needed capital. My voice stayed even. So I bought in quietly through entities you couldn't trace. Within 3 years, I owned 15%. When I met Evelyn, 31. By our wedding, 42. Today, 47. Every expansion you credit to your leadership, the Atlantic routes, the port modernization, the logistics software that saved you in 2015 was funded with my capital. I let the words settle. You work for me, Daniel. You just didn't know it. Then I turned to Lydia. She sat frozen, face pale, tears gathering. Lydia, I said gently, I wanted to know whether my daughter valued character or wealth, whether you loved me for who I am or for what you believed I lacked. Tonight, I have my answer. Your position at Whitman Maritime is terminated, effective immediately. Perhaps it's time you learned what a real career requires. Dad, she whispered. I didn't know. Would it have mattered? I lifted the torn check so they could see it. I never wanted your money, Daniel. I wanted family. I wanted to love your daughter without caring about status or inheritance. But you only ever saw someone you believed was beneath you. I dropped the pieces of the check onto the table. I've called an emergency board meeting for Monday. The agenda is simple. A vote on the CEO. You'll be removed and professional management will be installed. This is my company, Daniel shouted. I built it. No, I said quietly. You drove it to the edge of bankruptcy. I saved it while you sat here trying to buy me out of my marriage. I turned to Evelyn, still shaking, tears falling freely, and held out my hand. She took it without hesitation. We have a long drive ahead, I said softly. Behind us, the Whitman family sat amid the ruins of everything they thought defined them. For the first time in 23 years, they finally saw me clearly. The drive back to Cambridge was only 10 miles, yet it felt like crossing between two different worlds. We walked to the car in silence, the stone estate glowing behind us like something unreal, part dream, part nightmare. Evelyn's hand trembled in mine, and I held it tight as if she were the only solid thing left. The first 10 minutes passed without words. I drove through Wellesley's flawless streets, then onto the highway, as Evelyn watched the blurred city lights slide past the window. How long have you been planning this? She asked quietly. I wasn't planning revenge, I said, eyes fixed on the road. I invested in the company years before I met you. It was just a sound decision. But you let them treat you like that, she said, her voice breaking. For 23 years. For 18 months I tested them deliberately, I replied. Before that, I searched for words. I hoped they'd accept me for who I was, not what I had. She turned toward me. You could have told me, any time. Would you have believed I married you only for you? I asked. Not for your family or access to power. She was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe not at first. I needed you to know I chose you when there was nothing to gain, I said. That I stayed when logic said I shouldn't. Silence returned. Then Evelyn's voice cracked. You let our daughter think. I let your parents poison her against me, I said. I thought patience would teach her real values. I was wrong. Tears came then from both of us. I pulled over as the road blurred out of focus. What happens now? Evelyn asked once we could finally breathe. The company will survive. Daniel might be offered a consulting role, but the control was gone. He'd adapt or walk away. I finally turned to face her. As for us, that's your choice. She reached for my hand. I choose you. I always have. The man who shared that apartment with me for 23 years. That's who I love. Not the billionaire, but the man who made coffee each morning and listened without judgment. 20 minutes later, we pulled into our Cambridge lot. After the estate, our building looked small, ordinary, perfect. Inside our apartment, surrounded by 2 decades of shared life, she asked, What about the money? Your foundation, I said. We'll grow it here. We're keeping it. I don't need a mansion. Monday would bring consequences, but that night in our quiet Cambridge home, we were richer than the Whitmans had ever been, because we still had each other, honesty, and the life we had chosen together. Monday morning arrived gray and heavy with consequence. The boardroom at Whitman Maritime headquarters was all glass and steel, designed to intimidate. But at 9:01 a.m., as I took the seat at the head of the conference table, the seat Daniel had held for 40 years, I felt only quiet certainty about what needed to happen. The emergency meeting lasted 11 minutes. The agenda was simple: a vote on the CEO's position. The business case was clear: a major shareholder exercising his right to restructure management. Discussion was minimal. These were professionals who knew personal feelings had no place in fiduciary duty. The vote was 78% in favor of removal. Daniel sat at the far end of the table, diminished in a way unrelated to physical space. He said nothing, offered no defense, didn't meet anyone's eyes. When the vote concluded and the interim management team was announced, he simply stood and walked out. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Over the next 2 days, my phone collected 12 voicemails from Lydia. I didn't listen. Evelyn's phone lit up with texts. Mom, please. I didn't understand. I'm sorry. Please talk to me. She didn't respond, yet. By Tuesday evening, Lydia had apparently realized that without the Whitman Maritime connection on her resume, no one was returning her calls. The job market had a way of teaching lessons that 20 years of privilege had obscured. Helen called Evelyn 17 times between Monday and Wednesday. Wednesday morning, Evelyn finally answered. Please, Helen's voice was broken, nothing like the cold matriarch who had suggested buying me off. Let me explain. Let us make this right. I need time, Mother, Evelyn said quietly, and hung up. That afternoon, a courier arrived at our apartment. The envelope was addressed in careful handwriting I recognized as Theodora's, from years of formal invitations we rarely attended. Inside was a 2-page handwritten letter on cream stationery. Margot, I don't expect you to forgive us. What we did was unforgivable, but I need you to know we thought we were protecting you. We were wrong, so terribly, horribly wrong. Your father is devastated, not about the company, that hurts, but about losing you, about discovering that the son-in-law he dismissed is the man who saved everything he built. Please, when you're ready, can we talk? I promise. No more envelopes, no more checks. Just a mother who wants to understand the man her daughter married. Evelyn read it twice, then showed it to me. Do you think they mean it? She asked. I thought for a long moment. I think they're scared, and sometimes fear makes people honest in ways comfort never could. What would you do? I'd give them one chance, I said. One, but on our terms, in our apartment, No performance of wealth or status. If they can accept us as we are, maybe there's hope. Thursday morning, Evelyn sent a text. Dinner, our place. Friday, 7 p.m. No dress code, no expectations, just family. Theodora replied within seconds. Thank you. We'll be there. Friday, we made pasta. Nothing fancy, nothing elaborate, just the kind of meal we had shared countless times over 23 years. No crystal glasses, no china plates, no performance at all. When the doorbell rang at 7 p.m., exactly 1 week after the dinner that had changed everything, I took Evelyn's hand, and we opened the door together. They stood in our doorway looking smaller somehow, as if the week had diminished them in ways wealth could never compensate. Daniel wore jeans and a navy sweater, no tie, no tailored suit, no armor of executive authority. Helen had chosen simple black slacks and a cream blouse. Her only jewelry was a wedding ring I had noticed for 23 years, but never really seen before. No pearls, no diamonds, no performance. Thank you for having us, Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying none of the commanding certainty I'd heard across boardroom tables and formal dinners for decades. Helen held a bottle of wine, not from their private collection, just something from a local shop. Her hands trembled slightly as she offered it to Evelyn. Come in, Evelyn said, stepping back. Our Cambridge apartment had never been designed to impress. 800 square feet of comfortable, lived-in space, bookshelves lining the walls, photographs documenting 23 years of genuine moments. The living room opened directly into the kitchen. No separate dining room, no staff quarters, no marble or crystal anywhere in sight. Helen's eyes traveled slowly across the space. I watched her take in the worn sofa where Evelyn and I had spent countless evenings, the small table where we'd shared thousands of meals, the simple artwork we'd chosen together. This place is lovely, she said finally, and for the first time since I'd known her, her voice held no judgment. It feels like home. Margot had made pasta, nothing elaborate, just the marinara recipe her grandmother had taught her years before I'd ever met her. The scent of garlic and basil filled the small apartment as we sat at the kitchen table, 4 people in a space designed for intimacy rather than performance. Smells wonderful, Randolph said as Margot served. We ate in awkward silence for several minutes. Then Randolph set down his fork. Maxwell, he began, his voice careful. I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. I waited. Every dinner where I made you feel small, every comment about your work, your car, your background, every time I suggested you weren't enough. He paused, his jaw working. Treating you like you were worth exactly $350,000 and not a penny more, when the truth is, you're the man who saved my company and loves my daughter with an integrity I failed to recognize. He turned to Margot, moisture gathering in his eyes. Margot, I'm sorry I couldn't see what you saw in Maxwell. I'm sorry I valued social position over your happiness. You found a man who loves you for exactly who you are. That's what every father should want. I almost destroyed it because of my own pride. Theodora reached for Margot's hand, tears spilling freely now. I spent my whole life preparing you for a certain kind of marriage, she said. When you chose differently, I felt like you were rejecting everything I'd taught you, but you weren't rejecting anything. You were choosing something real over something hollow. And Ansley, her voice broke. We poisoned her mind against you both. That's on us. I set down my fork, meeting Randolph's eyes across the small table. I accept your apologies, I said quietly. But accepting doesn't mean forgetting. If we're going to rebuild this, it has to be real. No more judgments based on appearances. No more poison about who deserves whom. And Ansley, she's 20 years old. She can learn, but she needs to apologize herself when she's ready. Margot squeezed Theodora's hand. I want my parents back, she said softly. But I need you to see us. Really see us. Maxwell in jeans is still the man who owns $15 billion. That was the lesson. Randolph nodded slowly. Could I take you to lunch sometime, Maxwell? Just the two of us. Start again. Lunch sounds good, I replied. Ansley sent a letter, Theodora offered carefully, but she's not ready to face you yet. When she is, I said, we'll be here. It wasn't forgiveness yet. Forgiveness would take time, but it was a beginning, and sometimes a beginning is enough. 3 months can reshape a family, a company, and a quiet understanding of what wealth truly means. By February, Stone Maritime stock climbed 35% under professional management led by a CEO chosen not for pedigree but for proven competence. The company I'd saved 27 years earlier was finally thriving exactly as I'd always believed it could. Randolph now worked only 2 days a week, advising on legacy accounts and institutional relationships. Mostly, though, he listened to younger executives with sharper tools and to logistics specialists who understood modern supply chains better than he ever had. He sold the Mercedes, bought a Toyota Camry, and somehow seemed lighter because of it. The Brennan Family Foundation launched in January with a $75 million endowment. Margot became its director, no longer volunteering for someone else's vision, but building her own. Scholarships for students who wanted business degrees but lacked money. Housing assistance. Job training for people society had already dismissed. The kids nobody expects to succeed, she said while drafting the mission statement. Those are the ones who will change everything. Every 2 weeks, Randolph and Theodora came to our apartment for dinner. Sometimes they cooked. Theodora discovered she enjoyed it when no staff watched and no performance was required. They asked about books, not deals. Theodora volunteered 15 hours a week at the foundation, using her social connections for something that actually mattered. 6 weeks ago, a letter arrived in Ansley's careful, uncertain handwriting. Dad, I'm finally learning what you tried to teach me. I'm sorry it took 20 years and losing everything to understand. She'd taken an entry-level marketing job at a small tech startup. Nothing glamorous, nothing inherited. She rented a modest apartment in Somerville, paid her own bills, and rode the T to work like everyone else. She met Margot for coffee twice, but still wasn't ready to see me. She's getting there, Margot told me. 20 years of poisoning takes time to wash away, I said. I can wait. Tonight, after another Friday dinner, after Randolph and Theodora left with real smiles and promises to return, Margot and I stood on our small balcony overlooking Cambridge. The city lights shimmered below us, countless lives unfolding in apartments, much like our own. Do you ever regret letting them humiliate you for so long? She asked. Never, I said, pulling her closer. Because now I know your parents love you more than their pride. You chose me for who I am, and I don't need permission to be myself. Who are you, Maxwell Brennan? She asked. I smiled. I'm a 53-year-old logistics consultant. I'm a billionaire investor. I'm your husband. And I'm the man who proved the most powerful people in any room are usually the ones nobody notices. She kissed me as the city glowed below. Somewhere, Randolph was relearning his own company from the ground up. Somewhere, Theodora planned her next volunteer shift. Somewhere, Ansley worked late, building something real with her own hands. Here, in the modest apartment we chose on purpose, we were rich in the only ways that matter. That envelope did not change everything. The check did not. What mattered was the moment people revealed who they truly were and what you chose to do with that truth. I chose love. I chose honesty. I chose to prove that being underestimated can be the greatest advantage of all. When nobody expects you to win, victory tastes sweeter. My name is Maxwell Brennan. This is proof that character matters more than money, love matters more than status, and the greatest victories are the ones nobody saw coming. Stay humble, know your worth, and never let anyone make you feel small, simply because they cannot see how powerful you truly are. Looking back at my story, I realize God gave me 23 years to prepare for one 15-minute moment. Some people call me patient. I call it faith. Faith that the God who sees everything would reveal truth in his perfect timing. Don't wait as long as I did to show your worth. God doesn't call us to hide our light under a bushel forever. I let my family suffer 18 months of humiliation when one honest conversation could have prevented it. That was my mistake. Here's what I learned. God gave you talents not to prove yourself to others, but to serve his purpose. I thought I was teaching Randolph and Theodora a lesson. The truth God was teaching me was about pride, forgiveness, and that revenge belongs to him alone. If you're in my situation, underestimated, disrespected, carrying a secret that could change everything, ask yourself, am I waiting for God's timing, or am I feeding my own ego? This true story taught me that Grandpa's stories about honor and patience are beautiful, but true story wisdom also says, protect your family first. And this true story proves that when God orchestrates justice, it's always more perfect than anything we could engineer ourselves. Grandpa stories from my own father-in-law now include how God humbled him through the son-in-law he despised. Grandpa stories he tells Anansley now focus on character, not wealth. These grandpa stories became our family's redemption. Don't hide who you are to prove a point. Serve God. Love your family. Let him handle the rest.